Good morning. I apologize. I got everything ready and I looked up to say good morning. I didn't have the mic on. It is good to see everybody. Good to be here. I felt like, I don't know, it may come to me later. I was thinking of something just a second ago that I think I left that in my office. And now I don't remember what it is. I got sidetracked by realizing that I didn't have my mic on. But if it comes to me, I guess I can go grab it. All right, so we are studying in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. And as I mentioned, we covered verse 1 of this chapter last week because it seems to me that it seems almost obvious to me that it goes with, and I'm not the only one. I've seen a lot of other folks take that same position, and I agree. I think it just makes sense that it goes with the previous section, and it would be better at the end of chapter 7. And so sometimes, we have to remember that these chapter divisions are not inspired. Probably far more often than not, they're good and they're helpful. But sometimes you get a chapter break in the middle of a thought or something, and it just kind of, I forget who the preacher was. It was, talking years back, probably before I was even born. But there was one of the old-time preachers that they were talking about. I think it was like some cardinal in the Catholic Church that was riding horseback, and he would make these chapter and verse divisions as he was making these long trips places. And the preacher that was talking about this made the statement that he said, I think his horse might have jostled him a couple of times, and he made a division at the wrong spot. So anyway, bear that in mind, that sometimes it's not the best chapter division or even in verses. I've seen verses broken, right in the middle of a sentence. I ran across one, it was just a few months ago. I remembered it in my daily reading, and I was like, that is an odd place to divide that verse. But anyway, so chapter 8. I think I did this with chapter 7. I'll go ahead and do this with chapter 8 as well. My King James Bible has one heading for the entire chapter, and it just says, enjoy life. I think that's pretty weak for this chapter. It's certainly part of the chapter, but to just describe the whole chapter as that, I don't know. I think and I think you'll see that if you haven't read it already, you'll see that that's kind of not the best summation of the chapter. New King James has it, and bear in mind, I've learned that I think with the ESV, these headings are pretty across the board, but sometimes with King James or New King James, it might depend on the publisher who's publishing it. So again, those little headings, if you have those, they're not inspired. That's just somebody trying to give you a little a study help. So when you get to a section, or if you're looking for something, if I'm looking for a section where's that place where Jesus talked to the rich young ruler? Well, if I have those headings, I can look, and a lot of times you'll see rich young ruler is one of the headings. So those aren't inspired, and sometimes they'll vary from publisher to publisher or edition to edition. But I think in the ESV, if I'm not mistaken, they're pretty standard across the board. But the New King James, at least the one that I have, has verses 2 through 9 as obey authorities for God's sake. I forget, you got the New King James here, you can see that. And then you got, which I guess because it's starting a new chapter, it did that same heading for verse 1. But verse 1, the other New King James that I was looking at has that included with the last part of chapter 7. So obey authorities for God's sake. And that's what I say, 2 through 9. Yeah. Then it has death comes to all, 10 through 14, or 10 through the rest of the chapter. So obey authorities, death comes to all. Again, I don't know, it just seems a little too general, and I'm not as crazy necessarily about the ESV's breakup of the chapter either. You see there, keep the king's command, that goes down through verse 9. And then verse 10, those who fear God will do well. And then man cannot know God's ways, 14 through the end of the chapter through verse 17. So those are how these different versions break it up. The ESV's, I guess, would be, if I had to pick one of these three, I'd say that's the better. One brother divides the chapter up, chapter 8, as verses 1 through 9. He calls this section, chapters 8 and 9, he calls it frustrating. In other words, Solomon's going to talk a lot about frustrations and things like that. We mentioned this last week, kind of introducing this chapter, that, we enter a new year, a new season, and you see this in sports, you see this a lot of times in life, and everything is, we have these high hopes, high expectations, all these grand designs and plans, and sometimes we feel a little bit like, I don't remember where I first heard this. I've heard it a few times since then. I want to say it was maybe a coach who said this, but it's been repeated a lot. Sometimes it might even be like a championship game, and these teams, they prepare, and I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Both teams are preparing, right? They've got their game plan. They're going over it in practice again and again and again and again. And what sometimes happens, though, is you get to the game, and all of a sudden, it's just a beatdown. And that happened in this one particular situation. And again, I've heard it several times since, so I don't know who the original source is. But this one fella said, everybody has a plan until what? Y'all remember this? Until they get punched in the mouth. And that was the way he put it. And I think he was on the losing side of that. And he said, they kind of asked, well, what was wrong with your game plan or whatever? He says, nothing. We had our plan. We practiced it. We felt like we had it ready to go. But we got on the field and we got bullied. I mean, and in that context, he said, everybody's got a plan till you get punched in the mouth. And I've heard that several times since then. And, buddy, I've seen that play out in sports, in life. Sometimes we have all these grand designs, these high hopes and expectations, and, life is often frustrating. And that's kind of that brother's point as he divides this section 8 and 9 and calls it frustrating or frustrated. And so he calls verses 1 through 9 of chapter 8 frustration. He says he calls it frustrating authorities, but it's kind of almost confusing a little bit to me. So the idea is frustration caused by authorities. And then 10 through 14, frustration. Again, he's got frustrating justice, but the idea of frustration caused by justice, and I might add, or a lack thereof. Sometimes it's a lack of justice. And then he kind of divides this differently because he goes from verses 10 through 14 of chapter 8, frustration caused by justice. Then he goes to chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, frustrating end, frustration caused by the realization, again, we all have one end result, and it's death. Verses 11 through 18 of chapter 9, he calls it frustrating outcome, frustrated by some of the outcomes that we see. And then he has a section at the end that he calls handling the frustrating life. And that would be chapter 9, verses 7 through 10, chapter 8, verses 15 through 17. And he subdivides that as basically 9, 7, 8, 15 through 17, experience joy when you have it. Then he would say, seek joy in the frustration, chapter 9, verse 8. Enjoy who you have in life. Again, back to relationships, chapter 9, verse 9. Give yourself to the moment, chapter 9, verse 10. Look for the quiet in the noise, chapter 9, verse 10. Of course, we'll talk more about those. I think just for our sake and ease of study, I'm going to go straight through chapter 8. I'm not sure. I kind of see his point in the division there, but I think it works just as well to go right on through. So I think that's probably easier for all of us as we study it and follow to follow along. So again, so many variables in life, so many things that don't add up, they don't make sense. There's sometimes no rhyme or reason. I was talking to somebody about this just recently. You can exercise, you can eat right. I mean, you can go the keto, eat clean, all the different things that people talk about, whatever the latest fad is as far as diet. You can do that. You can exercise. I mean, don't miss a day. And yet, you could still end up you could end up in a tragic accident. You could end up with a serious illness, disease. Do y'all remember, man, this has probably been 10, 15 years ago easily. The guy that was going around to a lot of the talk shows and stuff, I can't remember his name, but he had the terminal illness, and he would do almost like a motivational talk to folks, and he was trying to encourage everybody, live your life to the fullest. And one of the things that he talks about in there, and he had a great mindset in this, but he had, I think it was some kind of cancer, I want to say. But this guy, every time he appeared on one of these shows, he went on Oprah and several of the other, daytime talk shows and even some nightly news type things. But every time, somewhere at the very beginning of that, he would talk about, now, I'm not a person that doesn't exercise. I'm not a person that smokes or drinks. I'm in good shape. And he'd drop down and start doing push-ups. And sometimes he'd do one-arm push-ups. And he's just showing you hey, I'm not a person that, sometimes we might be tempted to say, I feel bad for the guy, but should take better care of your body. And he's making the point that's not always what it's about. And he would go on to talk about how he's, and of course, it wasn't long before he died. I want to say it was like some kind of pancreatic. Yes, sir. Is that who it was? Basketball coach. But yeah, it was really, it was sad, but it was also his outlook and how he handled it was amazing. I really, really enjoyed listening to several times when he would give that little speech and all, and it was something else. But that's life, and you can. Somebody was telling me it's been several years ago, but I was thinking about it in that conversation I had recently of a fellow that was a preacher friend. It was telling me about a guy who was a member of the church. He lived, I think it was 7-ish miles from the church building. And he said it was very common if the weather wasn't just really, really cold or really, really rainy and stormy. So sometimes even if it was raining, he'd do it. But they would come to Sunday evening service, and he would have a change of clothes. He would change clothes at the building, send his church clothes home with his wife and family, and he'd run home. And that was how he got his Sunday run in. He ran every single day. And that was kind of just his thing. He loved to run. I always used to tell people when, of course, I haven't run as much in the last few years, just kind of gotten out of that habit. But when I used to run more, people say, oh, you like to run, huh? And I said, well, I like it okay. But really, I like to eat. And so I run so I could eat. But this guy liked to run. And one day, it was just at the end of a run. It wasn't a particularly difficult run. It wasn't like he just really overdid it. Just drop dead. And just life is so uncertain. And in this section, Solomon's going to look at some of the frustrations of life, some of the lessons, some of the conclusions that we can make and draw along with that, and help us. Hopefully, he wants to help us. God, through Solomon, wants to help us to understand more about God and his world so we don't get so frustrated. We don't waste our lives in frustration and sorrow, because if you let yourself, you look at things like that, you hear stories like that, this guy that's so healthy and he ends up with whatever that was, pancreatic cancer or something that just, it worked on him pretty quick. And, or somebody that just, there's a picture of health and they just drop dead. You could, if you let it, you could dwell on something like that and just kind of like give up. And some people do, not in the sense of they just freeze up and give up and just quit. They give up on God. And they just say, I'm just going to enjoy everything I can right now. Because there's just no rhyme or reason in this world. Might as well just live it up and enjoy what you can while you can. But Solomon is saying, don't waste your life in frustration and sorrow, and certainly don't waste it just giving up on God, turning away from God. Some things we have to realize, and this is kind of not necessarily an Ecclesiastes chapter 8 thing, but sometimes we have to realize that it's easy to forget. We live in a fallen world. Why do we live in a fallen world? Sin. Sin enters this world. And so we're sometimes so quick to attribute things to God, forgetting that that's not how God designed it. But he loves us enough that he gives us free will. And sometimes I'm going to suffer because of my own free will. But you know what? Sometimes I suffer because of somebody else's free will. And sometimes even the most innocent, like a child, can suffer because somebody decides to do drugs or drink alcohol and then get behind the wheel of a vehicle. And they might kill a person. Sometimes people are just, why would God do this? Why would God take this person? And sometimes even well-meaning people will say things like, well, God needed another angel or something like that, which is, there's so much wrong with that statement because, for one thing, people don't become angels when we leave this life. But people sometimes, they with all good intentions say that, but aside from the becoming an angel thing, it's not God that did that. It's not that God said, well, I'm ready for this one to come home, and so I'm going to cause a really tragic accident. Say, sorry to all you family members about your hurt, but hey, that's not how it goes. It's happening because we live in a fallen world. Sometimes even generational free will affects us. Of course, we're all often blessed by previous inventions and discoveries, but sometimes we suffer because of those things as well, right? So just we sometimes forget that. We're so quick to attribute things to God. I think we also sometimes fail to realize, I was in a Bible study this week and made this point, and I think it's very, very important. We sometimes fail to realize, because we see a lot, especially in the Old Testament, where people will attribute something to God. You see this with Naomi. She comes home, and they left Israel because of the famine. They go to Moab. They heard there was bread there. Her husband dies. Her 2 sons-in-law die. And then she hears, the famine is over. There's bread back home. Well, I'm going home. Her daughters-in-law go with her. And, of course, she tells them, I don't have any more sons. If I had a man and had a child right now, what, are you going to wait till he's old enough to marry? Go back to your people and live your life. And, of course, what was the other one's name? Orpah? Blank. I think so, yeah. Orpah, she goes back. Ruth clings to Naomi. But when Naomi gets home, she says to the people, they say, oh, look, it's Naomi. Naomi's back. She says, don't call me Naomi. Call me what? I think the word is like Marah. But what does it mean? Bitter. Why does she say, call me bitter? I've heard her call me Al, but she just called me. Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Somebody laughed at my joke. It's a tough crowd sometimes. Billy, come on. So I was looking at you there, man. Yeah, she says, call me bitter because the hand of the Almighty has been bitter toward me. Yeah. And even there, I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes, it's hard to tell in some of these contexts because sometimes people do. They just miss it. And they think, Job said, the Lord gave, the Lord taketh away. But it wasn't the Lord that took away. But a lot of times you'll see this, especially in the Old Testament, and it is a figure of speech in Hebrew where they attribute something to God, and what they're saying is not God did this. It means God allowed it. And sometimes God will use that figure of speech. What's that? Yes. Yeah, now God does at times say he will do something if, especially in Deuteronomy, if they're not true to him, if they're not faithful to him. But in a lot of these cases, you're like, okay, well, that's, here's Naomi, and she's a good Jewish woman. So sometimes people look at that and say, why is God so bitter toward her? Well, she could be misunderstanding, or it might be that she's using that figure of speech. And sometimes God will even say, I did such and such. I do this, I do that. And it's the idea that he's allowing it. And so, and sometimes even people then say, well, if he allows it. But again, you got to understand freedom of choice. We're not robots. God doesn't want robots. He wants people who choose to serve him. And I was trying to remember there's a term in logic. I just went blank on what do you call it? But anyways, you always have a major premise, minor premise, and a conclusion. I guess it's just maybe the logical argument. Maybe felt like there was a name that I'm forgetting, but love allows freedom of choice. That was the major premise this guy used. I think this might have been Eric Lyons from Apologetic Express, or it might have been Kyle Butt. Love always allows freedom of choice. Well, we understand that's true. If I try to tell somebody you're going to love me, well, I can't make anybody love me. Love always allows freedom of choice. God is love. I think I got those backwards. God is love is the major premise. Love always allows freedom of choice. Therefore, God is love. God allows freedom of choice. And so, some of the frustrations that we see in life, generally, even looking as we study Ecclesiastes, it's due to bad choices that people have made. And that sometimes is an effect of freedom of choice. But we don't want to lose our freedom of choice, because then we're just robots. God doesn't want us to lose our freedom of choice, because he wants us to want to serve him and to come to be with him forever in heaven. So that's just kind of getting some context here for chapter 8. So again, verses 2 through 9, that's this idea of being frustrated by authorities. Look at verse 2 where this section begins. He says, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. For the sake of your oath to God is the way the New King James has it. And you see it's slightly different in the ESV, but I don't know, it just seems to me that New King James idea there might be a little better. But it reminds us of Romans 13. Really, I think I had verse 1 in my Romans 13:1. No, I just put Romans 13. It's not the entire chapter, but it's not just first couple of verses either. It's a few different verses there where Paul says, let every soul be subject to the authorities, the powers that be, we sometimes say, civil authority. And he says Paul there gives the reason in Romans 13, because they're ordained of God. And he even goes on to say he's a minister of God. So, as I put here in my notes, it's a very similar, though much more concise thought as what we read in Romans 13. Verses 3 and 4, these are a little bit difficult. And I told y'all this, so there's some verses in Ecclesiastes that I'm kind of like, again, big picture, no problem with this book. But sometimes some of the going verse by verse, I encounter some verses and I'm like, And it's tempting just to kind of observe the Passover and move on. But he says, be not hasty, verse 3, to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Where the word of a king is, there is power, and who may say unto him, what doest thou? Well, you see it there in the New King James and ESV. Don't be hasty to go from his presence. Don't take your stand for an evil thing or in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. And then verse 4, you see a slight difference here in the New King James. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? ESV has, for the word of a king, or the word of the king, is supreme. And who may say to him, what are you doing? So, again, it's a little bit difficult here, but there's a couple of possibilities. It might be, one, he's saying, don't be so quick to get out of the king's sight. In other words, or at least we might say, for example, an example of that being breaking his law, breaking the king's law, breaking civil law. Don't be so hasty to do that, thoughtless, careless to do that, because you'll suffer for it. The law is there, and you break the law, and there's punishment for the lawbreakers. That might be something as minor as a ticket. Might be something as major as prison, right? Or perhaps verse 4 is clarifying verse 3, which I think might possibly be the more likely. I don't know. That's just, sometimes I look at these and I change my mind, and that's where I am right now. I'll say that. It might be that verse 4 is clarifying verse 3, saying, in other words, you may disagree with the king. You may disagree with his law. In our context, the government or his law. You might disagree with it, but what can you do? And you know, I know sometimes people might say, well, you can get out and you can vote and you can, well, in our country, to an extent, yes. But I mean in the immediate sense. I'm driving down the road and, well, I'll give you a perfect example. Back when I was in preaching school, you get to the 4-lane. Of course, now you got I-22, that I-22 corridor that goes basically to Memphis. But you didn't have that. You had to wind through Highway 78 and all. And then somewhere about 10 or so miles before the Mississippi line, you got on the 4-lane. And it was Highway 78, but it was 4-lane. And when you hit Mississippi, it actually went to 70 miles an hour. And, you know, as a young fella that a lot of times had gone home and is in a rush to get back to school, that was nice. And so you'd be rocking along at 70 miles an hour, and then when you hit New Albany, Mississippi, for no apparent reason, it drops to 55. And there's like one little sign. There's not like reduced speed ahead, nothing like that. And man, New Albany loved to park it there and get folks that missed that. Ask me how I know. And I would come through there and I would say, this is the stupidest thing. Why do they drop that? Why is that changed? It's still 4-lane. It doesn't make sense. But what could I do about it? Nothing. When I got pulled over because I forgot and missed that sign, I didn't miss it. I'd seen it before at that point, but I just wasn't paying attention. What could I do? Nothing. That seems to me the most likely, at least again, where I am right now, that verse 4 is kind of clarifying. What are you going to do? Nothing, because the law is the law. The king is the king. And it seems he's saying, don't leave his presence, here back to the king part, don't leave the king's presence all upset, all frustrated. Don't leave that reduced speed zone or enter it all upset, frustrated, barking to nobody in particular, because I mean, I'm driving by myself and sometimes I just carry on and rant and rave about this. What's the point? You're just frustrating yourself. You're just living your life frustrated if all you're going to do is complain and bark and rant and rave about stuff like that. What does it change? Sometimes Ecclesiastes gets on my toes a little bit, right? I don't know about y'all. Yes, sir.
This is difficult for all of us to understand sometimes. Those in authority, such as talk about here, we have to realize that we don't need to make a habit of questioning authority, because we get to the end of the book, this verse that we talk about, fear God and keep his commandments. There are a lot of commandments of God. At some point in our lives, when we're mature, we say, this is dumb as dirt. I mean, why do you say do this for? But we do it because he has the authority.
Yeah.
If we don't start that in home and with civil authority, we won't get it with God either.
That's true. And, I've often heard that and even said that over the years, that if our children, if a child doesn't learn to respect authority at home, he won't respect authority at school, and then before long he won't respect authority, civil authority, police officers and so on, and government and just laws in general. And eventually, that spills over into the overall area of no respect for God and his authority. And that's a kind of a big theme that in this section and in Ecclesiastes, in a roundabout way, it doesn't always come out and say it, but yeah, because Jimmy was pointing out, you get to the end of the book, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all, or this is the whole of man. That's God's authority. And there are times it doesn't make sense to us, and we may think that this is crazy. And think how many people balk at commands of God like baptism. And people will say things like, there's nothing magical about the water. I don't see sins floating in the baptistry. And they'll say things like that betray a lack of respect for the authority of God. Because Brother Marshall Keeble used to say, it's not about the water. It's about the one who said to get in the water. Because he has authority. And so there are things that don't make sense. I've got a sermon I've preached. I know I've preached it here. It's been a while. But I think I just called it God's commands. And there are moral commands, there are arbitrary commands. Moral commands make sense. In fact, sometimes even as we're children or with our own children, we'll say, now honey, you took that. That doesn't belong to you. And we might even say, would you like it if they took something from you? Well, no, Mommy, no, Dad. All right, then you don't need to take anything from them. And some of us learned about moral commands the hard way because maybe, you pinch somebody and Mom comes up and does what? Just take a plug out of you. How's that feel? Well, it hurts. Well, okay, that's how it feels to them too. I read one time about a little boy that just about 4 or 5 years old, and he had a new baby sister, and she was just starting to kind of crawl around or whatever, and the mom came running in the room because she heard that boy holler. And when she came in there, he just, and baby sis had just a handful of his hair, was just grabbing it, and he was mad at her. And the mom said, now, honey, just calm down. She doesn't know any better. She doesn't know that hurts. Just relax. And so she left to go back to whatever she was doing in the other room. And just a little bit, she hears the little baby screaming and crying. And she comes running in there, and little big brother, he's got a handful of her hair. And he says, she knows now. So we'll have to learn respect for authority. And so it does seem that part of what he's saying here is like, you may disagree with it, but what are you going to do? Some things we can't change. And boy, again, back to Jimmy's point, when you get to the ultimate level, God's authority, you can't change that. And so moral laws, they make sense. I shouldn't steal because I don't want somebody to steal from me. I shouldn't kill because I don't want to be killed. Those just make sense to us. But when it comes to those arbitrary commands, they don't necessarily make sense. And baptism would be one of those. The Lord's Supper, in fact, a lot of people do look at the Lord's Supper and they say, what an odd way to remember the death of Christ. Like, if he had done a survey, we might have come up with all kind of different things. Put a cross on every street corner. The people will remember. Maybe some kind of jewelry that every Christian, when you become a Christian, you get this piece of jewelry and you wear that, and that'll remind you every day. All these different things we might come up with, but that's not what he said. He just gave us a simple memorial. And it's not on us to try to analyze it and figure out if it makes sense or whatever. It's just do it, obey. And that's how arbitrary commands are. Marching around a city once a day for 6 days, 7 times a day on the 7th day, shouting, blowing horns. Is that typical military strategy? No. But it worked. Oh, you have leprosy. Go dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River and you'll be clean. A lot of doctors prescribing that those days, huh? No. But it worked. And so there are moral commands, there are arbitrary commands. And again, Solomon's saying, hey, some things you can't change. And so we need to learn to respect authority, and sometimes we're just making our own lives frustrating. We just go around grumbling about it. So here is wisdom. We won't always like what the government, and I mean, in this news to us all, we won't always like what the government's doing. We won't always like what those in power are doing. They will frustrate you. And maybe, it might be an election, it might be a local, state, even a federal election, and maybe your candidate wins, and man, you're excited, and he's doing great things, and then he turns around and does something so boneheaded and ridiculous, and you're just like, some people even will get to the point they'll say, I'm sorry I ever even supported this guy, and they just turn, and I'm going to support another candidate, maybe even another party. All that's just silly to me. Almost said stupid. I'm tempted to just say it, stupid. Because I can tell you what, politicians, leaders, kings, government, they'll always frustrate you. You're looking to that for some kind of meaning, purpose, man, you're setting yourself up for some real serious disappointment. Israel thought they wanted a king. Give us a king like everybody else has, Samuel. And Samuel tried to warn them. Sometime when you get a chance, go read 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 20. He tried to warn them. You want a king? You better be careful what you ask for, because he will frustrate you. Your sons, he's gonna draft them. And they're going to go off to war for him. Your daughters, he's going to draft them too. They're going to be in his kitchens. They're going to be cooking. They're going to be helping serve and wait on his tables and all that. You want a king? You sure about that? Tried to warn them. And so Solomon seems to be saying here, just obey for God's sake, for the sake of your oath, in other words, your Christianity, we would say. And don't think that the government's going to give your life purpose or meaning. Don't think the government is going to give your life purpose or meaning. Or destroy it either. Because sometimes we get so down in the dumps and we'll carry on like we're so disappointed because if I thought the government was going to give my life meaning, purpose. But we also sometimes get so carried away. If this candidate doesn't win, that candidate doesn't win, or something happens within the government, and we act like the world is just going to fall apart. Now, I'm not saying we should act like immoral decisions or whatever are just no big deal and shouldn't, speak out about it or whatever. But understand, God's still on the throne, and he will be on the throne. And nobody, no government, no leader, now or ever will change that. And we need to realize that. So, frustrated by those authorities. Verses 10 through 13, by the way, as we move into verse 10 here. Verses 10 through 13 remember we talked about that list of, I think there's 18, 19 vain things that are listed throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Here's the 15th, verses 10 through 13. Man's attitude toward evil. This is as the World Video Bible School notes list it. Verse 14 is going to list the 16th vain thing that Solomon mentions, according to them. The system of justice and retribution. But look at, dropping down to, he goes on in verse 5 of chapter 8 here. Whoso keepeth the commandments shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. Because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Remember chapter 3, those first few verses. Therefore the misery of man is great upon him, for he knoweth not that which shall be. For who can tell him when it shall be? There's no man that hath power over the spirit to retain the spirit, neither hath he power in the day of death. There's no discharge in that war. There's some things you just can't do anything about. There's no discharge in the war of mortality. You're not getting out of that, in other words. Neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. But don't think, I'll just turn to grab all the gusto I can in this life and just do whatever I want. Live for self. He says wickedness, you're not going to be any better off. In fact, you're going to be worse off, because there is a day of reckoning. And he says, all this have I seen and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There's a time There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. You could rule over others and even still do that to your own hurt. You might be tempted to become drunk with power. You might be tempted to become domineering and unkind. And you do that, and you might be the man. You might be the one that's got all the money, all the power, but you rule over another in that way. You do it to your own hurt. Why? Because you're going to have to stand before God and give an account. And part of that's how we treat others, how we interact with others. Okay, time's short. Let me say, let's look at 10 through 14. We might be able to just kind of do a quick summary. I'm having to move a little bit quicker because I'm trying everything I can. I want to finish Ecclesiastes by the time we finish this quarter. So I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This is also vanity. Well, again, there's that 15th vain thing. But he's dealing here with the idea of frustrated by justice or sometimes lack thereof. And verse 10, you'll see the ESV version may be better there, where he says, I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place. They were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also was vanity. If that is, in fact, the better rendering, then it's the idea of frustration and how the wicked often seem to get praised in spite of their wickedness, in spite of their evil deeds. And, you know, Isaiah talks about this in Isaiah chapter 5. Woe to them that call good evil and evil good, and put light for darkness, darkness for light, sweet for bitter, bitter for sweet. And that happens sometimes, and that can be frustrating. Again, don't put all your eggs in that basket for government. Certainly don't put all your eggs in this basket over here for justice, at least not here on this earth. Yeah, Psalm 73, you got a psalmist that says, hey, I was near to falling away, turning away, and losing my faith is how we would put it. When I looked at how prosperous the wicked were, and then he said, I got to thinking about this when I went to the house of the Lord, and I realized that, you know what? There's a day of reckoning coming, and that's going to make all the difference. So then he says, verse 11, boy, that's such a truth. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. You can see this on a very small scale in a home. You let one child start getting away with something, and the others, they'll see that, and they'll start getting more and more out of hand. But it also happens on a societal scale as well. People get more and more out of order when things are not addressed, and especially quickly. 12 and 13, he's going to add perspective. No matter what God sees, he knows he'll handle things, and the God of all the earth, Genesis 18:25 says, will always do what is right. And then verse 14, sometimes the wicked receive what the righteous should receive, and vice versa. Think in terms of Jesus. And folks, that's frustrating. That is so frustrating. He says it's vanity, but it happens living here in a fallen world. All right, let's stop there, and Lord willing, we'll pick up with that next section, beginning at verse 15, experiencing the joy even in the midst of some of these frustrations. Thank y'all very much. We'll have a break before worship.